Welcome to the working session. This means that you're supposed to participate, not just the people up front. And two of the people up front are on the screen, and I'm glad to see them and hear them. I've now seen and heard both of them this afternoon, so at least for now, we have everybody we're supposed to have. That's good. This is the best, this is by all means the best Zoom hookup I've ever seen. So I want to thank you for, again, give me your name. Andy. I want to thank Andy for keeping the technology flowing. Yes. It's always flow like this. Some of you may not know me because I last attended one of these conferences about 30 years ago. Don Duclow, my old friend and fellow graduate school person, and drinking companion and other things. Don,
partners in crime.
Partners in crime. Don introduced me to Nicholas of Cusa and introduced me to Kalamazoo, where I went a few times and came to a couple of these conferences. But I am by no means any kind of a Nicholas of Cusa aficionado even. I wrote one paper on him. And that was because I'm a warmed over physics major who wrote a paper on his contribution or lack thereof to science, maybe to the scientific mentality in the modern age. So we have all kinds of themes running through this, light for one. And I remembered that Schopenhauer, who wasn't a real optimist, said something about when we die, we awake to a light of which our sunlight is but the shadow. That sounds like Plato's cave to me and is also relevant, therefore, although nobody's talking about Schopenhauer in here. I was looking at one of Jason's questions, does mysticism or contemplation have a political purpose? And he asked that this morning. Something to think about. Lee Miller, in what sense is contemplation or mystical theology? In what sense is that a journey or a pilgrimage? Something to think about. And we're all contemplating whether intellect or love is primary in the ascent to God. That's what this session's actually about. That made me think, of course, about Trinity in cosmology and the love of God explicating the universe and the poor old cosmologists and physicists trying to complicate it again and find out where it came from. That's all I'm going to say on that. They warned me not to say too much. So now we have my friend Don. As I say, we were fellow graduate students at Bryn Mawr. He got his doctorate a year or two ahead and sort of helped me slide into my position later when I came to Gwynedd Mercy College to teach with him for many years. And so we've been friends and partners in many ways for a long time. In fact, that Don also was the best man at my wedding to Janet, who's back here knitting, so she doesn't have to think about what we're talking about. So the question then is about desire and love in Cusanus mystical theology, whether the intellect is primary or whether the affectus is primary. And with that, I will steal my papers, trying not to steal Don's.
I've got mine here.
Okay. As a matter of
my own copies.
As a matter of fact, one of these is a copy of what Don sent out. So have fun, Don.
Thank you, Rick. So glad that you're back with us and among the faithful in this lovely little congregation and this kind of really international congregation. Just a few very brief introductory comments. Jason emailed me in July with the draft program for this conference. I was surprised, no, I was really shocked to read that it is in tribute to Donald Duclow. Who's he? I gladly offer my heartfelt thanks to Jason and the organizers for this great honor. But this being the American Cusanus Society, the honor comes with a price. The draft program included a working session on selected essays of Donald Duclow. I thought this was a really bad idea to inflict on you and on myself. I suggested that we discuss a question. And for me, this is a real question. I don't have the answers. A question that has been puzzling me for a long time. How to do justice to the role of desire and love in Cusanus mystical theology. This question has rarely been asked because commentaries often focus on intellect in Nicholas' thought. We have asked you to read just the last few pages of one such commentary, my now very ancient article, Intellect and Mystical Theology in Nicholas of Cusa. It was a pretty good article, perhaps even above average, like the kids in Lake Wobegon. However, a retractio is now in order, since I think that the article overstated intellect's role and settled Nicholas too comfortably among the speculative mystical theologians. 30 plus years ago, I was working naively within the binary of affective, intellectual, or speculative mysticism. We now recognize this binary's distortions. Its widely criticized sexist bifurcation between women and men mystics. And secondly, its failure to trace the nuanced interplay of affect and intellect in individual mystics and theologians. My article gives us exhibit A for the second distortion, since it stresses, and I'll quote myself, Nicholas' consistent intellectualism and claims that he stands within a tradition of speculative spirituality whose themes he elaborates with an intensity and thoroughness very much his own, end of quote. But when we look more closely, as we will today, Cusanus presents a richer, more subtle play among affect and intellect, love and knowledge. This interplay is what we shall explore very shortly. I'm positively delighted that Paula Pico Estrada and Bernard McGinn are with us today, because they are among those who led me to rethink my article and will guide us toward more precise conjectures about desire and love and Nicholas' thought. In his chapter on Cusanus in the Harvest of Mysticism and Medieval Germany, Bernie showed that, quote, Cusa coincidentated, that's a hard word, Bernie, made a coincidence of the opposing positions on seeing God into a new synthesis on the basis of the necessary interdependence of both love and knowledge in the path to union or filiation, as he termed it, end of quote. Similarly, Paula's article from Affectus to Caritas provided significant nuance as she, quote, extended the notion of intellectual nature, showing the path of the mind towards its end is understood by Nicholas as a movement of love, end of quote. Now, just to open the discussion, I'd like us to look at Cusanus' sermon number 7, which shows just how affective Nicholas could be. He preached this sermon on the Feast of Mary Magdalene in 1431. In the third section, the preacher engages Magdalene in a dialogue on love and charity, Dilectio et Caritas. Following the Song of Songs, Bernard of Clairvaux, Bonaventure, and Rudolph of Bieberbach, Magdalene describes her progress through love, her ecstasies, and her unquenchable desire. The preacher addresses her, O woman, you were given 2 large eagle wings, affection and intellect, affectio et intellectus, so that you might fly into the desert of contemplation and penance, end of quote. Not only are affect and intellect engaged in Magdalene's quest, they also both move into ecstasy. She says, very often I fell into states of ecstatic affection, together with ecstasy of mind, ecstasis mentis. For because of very vehement love, I did not belong to myself, but to my beloved. I sent forth my spirit so fervently to my beloved that I was ecstatic in mind, end of quote. Then when the Magdalene asks the beloved, capital B, to raise me gently unto a greater degree of love, divine love replies in familiar Cusan terms, Consider the love on the part of your beloved, and consider your beloved's nature, which is incomparable to all things, because there is no comparative relation, nulla proportio, no comparative relation of the finite to the infinite. And think of what union, connexio, of infinite love with finite love is. No union is higher or more wondrous than the union of a creature with the Creator, end of quote. Nicholas, or at this point, I'm not sure if it's Nicholas or Magdalene is going on here. As her, Magdalene's intellect and affection lovingly reflected on these things, she ascended still higher. And she says, the more I ascended, the more insatiable my love grew to be, end of quote. Having tasted her beloved, Magdalene experienced a maximal hunger. That's a quote. Because, she says, I did not possess my beloved as a whole, as I was desirous of doing, end of quote. Echoing Hadewig and Eckhart, she speaks of this infinite hunger, where the more she eats, the more she hungers. Her yearning could be satisfied only in two ways, with the Eucharist and with death. As she asks divine love, feed me with the beloved, feed me with the beloved, so that I would die with the beloved. And then, of course, in the gospel, as she, having entered Christ's tomb, she was led, quote, into the most bitter death of my beloved. And together with my beloved, I died continually in love, end of quote. Buried with and within her beloved, she then rose and says that he led me into an eternal heavenly homeland, where I now eternally possess my beloved in full and satisfying, with the full satisfying of my hunger, end of quote. As it traces Magdalene's mystical journey, this early sermon is clearly not typical Cusanus fare. Not only may it be his most affective text, but it reads like a compendium of affective mystical theology. Yet it also builds on two key Cusan themes: the reciprocity of affect and intellect, and the lack of proportion between the finite and the infinite. We may wonder and ask, as we shall, if this sermon's Magdalenan themes echo, however faintly, in Nicholas' later work. To conclude, let me glance very briefly at Cusanus' sermon number 21, preached on Epiphany, 1439 or 1440, when De Docta Ignorantia was in process. Here, Nicholas sounds an affective note that echoes Thomas Gallus and Hugh of Balmo. Citing Augustine, he says, he who enters himself truly finds God, and he goes on to explain that. He who draws near to life, he draws near to life when through love, amorem, he is fastened to him who has been found within himself. Hence, he must pass beyond everything perceptible, everything imaginable, everything intelligible, in order to arrive by means of desire alone, solo desiderio, at the supremely desirable one, end of quote. During the Tegernseed debate, Vincent of Augsbach vigorously defended this view, and Cusanus firmly rejected it. He had changed his mind and rethought the dynamic of desire, love, and intellect in mystical theology. Now I gladly turn to Paula and Bernie to comment briefly on how they see this dynamic in Cusanus, and then we'll ask, following the tradition of Gettysburg working sessions, we'll invite all of you to join the conversation. Thank you.
I think what Don has in mind is for all of our three speakers to speak first, and then to have the free-for-all.
Right.
And therefore, I will just pause to introduce Paula Pico Estrada, who is in South America as we speak, who has, I believe, from what I read here, both her degree and her position in Buenos Aires. Her university was there, and now she teaches at a different university, I believe. And so, however, in her development, she has learned from Don and Bernie McGinn, and therefore is very much a part of this conversation. I will point out, it was Paula this morning who asked about the political implications of having to go back into the world after mystical contemplation or ecstasy. Was it not you?
No, not really. I asked something else, but related to the political position of Vincent.
Okay.
So yes, I'm interested in the practical part, if that is the
practical part, yes. And then at the end this morning, you said something about the affect and the intellect. The affect aspect having a horizontal, sort of like a church council, right. And the intellect having a vertical component, something like a papacy. So maybe there is something both on the practical side and on the intellectual side, and also perhaps on the ecstatic side, to be found in what Paula is about to tell us. So go ahead, Paula.
Thank you, Rick. So first of all, I would like to thank Don Duclow so much for having invited me today to join this working session, which is part of a larger tribute to him and to his intellectual work, as you all know. And every time that our paths crossed, he has helped me and he has advised me. And so I think I can bear witness to the fact that at least in Don's case, his intellectual work includes an affective dimension. I'm very happy and honored to participate with him and with Bernard McGinn in this session on desire and love in Cusanus mystical theology. When I wrote my short article on this subject back in 2016, I had not read Don's article yet. Neither had I read Professor McGinn's chapter in The Harvest of Mysticism. Don suggested I should read both, which I did. And I would like to say that although my former paper there, I stress the role of affection in the human mind's journey to God, I agree with Don when he writes about Nicholas' consistent intellectualism. And I think that he belongs to the tradition that Bernard McGinn calls intellective Dionysianism. At the same time, I think that the associations that we inevitably make when we hear the word intellect should be nuanced by considering that although Cusanus defines the human mind's essential function as intellect, the human intellect for him is, like its exemplar, threefold. And this condition is described in the Conjecturis, paragraph number 177, where Cusanus argues that the intellect cannot achieve perfection if it does not develop as a whole. And since it is, I quote now, disposed to understand and to love, end of the quote, to perfect the power of understanding will also imply perfecting the power to love. There I was quoting again, sorry. Then in paragraph 183, he adds that for us to achieve our goal, we must not only develop the power, we must not only develop the power to understand and the power to love, we must also develop the power to be just, that is equality, that is acting according to the law that we find within ourselves. So that would be a third dimension, actually. But during the debate on the nature of mystical theology, the emphasis was laid on the relation between knowledge and love. So I will leave now equality or justice aside and mention a sermon that perhaps should be considered among the other texts, a sermon that, as far as I know, has not received the attention that Nicholas himself said it had. It is Sermon 57, which is dated on June the 5th, 1446. And it was written by Cusanus on the occasion of the Feast of Pentecost. And it is part of a series that during his visit to the Abbey of St. Quentin in June 1452, he left for the monks to copy. Its title is Stay Until You Have Been Clothed with Power from on High. And it quotes Luke 24:49. And I believe that although because of his description, I believe that this is the sermon he tells the Tegernsee monks to read when he briefly answers Caspar Eindorfer's letter number 3. As it is well known, Eindorfer had asked Cusanus, I quote, whether the devout soul, without the exercise of the intellect, or even without a preceding or simultaneous exercise of it, could attain God by affection alone or by the summit of the mind, which they call synderesis, and be moved or carried immediately within him. This is the question that triggers the exchange. And the translation I read belongs to Tom speaking. So if we look at the sermon, so when Nicholas answers this letter, he says, I have not much time now, please read the sermon I left. And if we look at it, I don't know if the monks did, but if we look at the sermon for an answer, we find that it begins with a statement that we move toward eternal peace led by desire. Being rational creatures, the desire that moves us is a desire of the spirit. He says, desiderium spiritus, that is a genitive that in Latin can be read both subjectively and objectively. This construction is deliberate because Cusanus is speaking of our love for the Spirit, which has been sown in our souls by the Spirit himself, who loves us. So after having reviewed in the first part of the sermon all the things achieved in the mission of the Holy Spirit, Cusanus begins the second part by remarking, and I quote him, that the gospel teaches us how the spirit of intelligence should rise above all opposition. End of the quote. His argument, it's brief and it's full of evangelical quotations, but it's philosophical in its working. And it presents three types of coincidences between loving and being loved, between knowing and being known, and between loving, being loved on the one side, and knowing, being known on the other. The problem that he seeks to solve resembles the one that moves the Tegernsee monks. If God is unknowable, how can we achieve our goal, which is union with God? To make a long story short, I'll say that Cusanus' answer is based on the coincidence of love and knowledge, however imperfect, and in identifying knowledge with faith. Following John 14:21, he argues that it can be said that whoever loves God is loved by him. However, it cannot be said that whoever knows God is known by him, because God remains unknowable to us. So, in spite of this lack of proportion, which Don just mentioned when he quoted Sermon 7, we remain intellectual natures, and our Creator has sown in us the desire for truth, which, in the words of this sermon, is the desire for the Spirit. How can we fulfill this desire, given that in its realization resides the perfection of our human nature? So the answer is through love, not through knowledge, because God is unknowable, but he is lovable. That is at our reach. So, but yet, our love of God is not blind. It implies knowledge, and this knowledge is, as I said before, generated by faith. So to conclude, I will quote very, very shortly Sermon 57. Here is how love expresses perfect faith, because he who is loved is not ignored. Hence, this is Christian theology, that faith formed by charity is cognition, which coincides with being known. So this is the answer in the sermon to the problem originated by God's incommensurability. Although he is beyond human comprehension, he is susceptible to being known through faith formed by love. So when we turn toward him with loving faith, we become able to progress in the pursuit of a final goal. So the fact that Cusanus identifies faith with a seminal form of knowledge, I think it adds an additional ingredient to what Don has just described as the subtle play among affect and intellect, love and knowledge. So thank you.
Now we arrive at Bernie McGinn, who is debating seniority with Jerry Christensen. So Don tells me that at times at Kalamazoo, Bernie would invite his younger friends to come to his and his wife's room at the hotel or wherever, and share foot medicine. And that was Irish medicine. And that was Irish whiskey. And so there is something to be said for the idea that contemplation is sometimes assisted by a small to moderate amount of alcohol, and especially good whiskey from the British Isles. So on with Bernie McGinn. The other comment that Don makes is that he writes books faster than I can read them. And his present opus, now being completed, is The Presence of God, which is a study of the whole sweep, basically, of medieval and maybe even later mystical theology. So let us welcome now Bernie McGinn to give us his response to Don.
This is unfortunately tea, not Irish whiskey, but I'll read my piece, even though I'm not perhaps as inspired as I might be.
I'll tell you the difference between American and British movies afterwards. Well, right. Now, since I interrupted. In the American movies, people shown drinking alcohol are actually drinking tea. In British movies, people shown drinking tea are actually drinking alcohol. So there you go.
I like it. So let me begin by saying that it's an honor and a delight to be asked to participate in this discussion honoring my old friend Don Duclow for all that he's done, not only for studies of Nicholas of Cusa, but also for the history of medieval thought. One of the dangers in the study of mysticism is what I call the urge to cubbyhole. That is the desire to find convenient boxes or niches into which we can stuff mystical authors. To be sure, classifying things and doctrines is not bad in itself, but cubbyholing is classification gone wrong. To my mind, the bigger the cubbyhole, the less helpful and the more misleading it is. Two of the worst examples are, first, the cubbyhole of apophatic versus cataphatic mystics, and second, that of affective versus speculative or intellectual mysticism. All mystics, I would argue, are both apophatic and cataphatic. It is the question of how the individual mystic relates the apophatic and cataphatic dimensions in the pursuit of God that is important, even though many will put more weight on one or the other side of the equation. Similarly, the unhelpful split between affective and speculative mysticism, which seems to go back a century or more to some German scholars of the 1920s, often hinders our efforts to pay real attention to what the mystic is saying. It's very hard, close to impossible, to find a mystic who does not have something to say about both love and knowledge. Again, it's a question of what they have to say about the two powers and how they relate their respective activities that is important. Thus, Meister Eckhart is often called a speculative or intellectual mystic, and it's true that he gives a central role to Intellectus, Vernünftigkeit, in his teaching and preaching. But saying this does not mean that we should neglect Eckhart's teaching on love. Anyone who has read Eckhart's sermons through can testify that love is a dominant theme in very many of the sermons. And as Charlotte Radler showed in a fine article some years ago, you cannot understand Eckhart without grasping the importance of love in his thinking. So too with our friend Nicholas of Cusa, who aptly summarized his mature view of the relation of love and knowledge in the famous September 1452 letter to Caspar Eindorfer, when he says, in every love, Delexio, in every love by which a person is carried into God, knowledge, cognitio, enters in, although it does not know the essence that it loves. There is then a coincidence of knowledge and ignorance, or a learned ignorance. What could be more Cusan? The same message is clear in the final two chapters of the De Visione Dei that conclude the famous Tegernsee debates. Chapter 24, Cusa advises the monks to imitate the apostles in adhering to Christ's message. Just as all the powers of body and soul must be harmonized with the intellect itself is perfected by submitting in faith to the word of God. So we just heard a lot about how important faith is. Cusa says that Christ teaches only two things: the faith by which the intellect approaches God, and the love by which it is united to him. Love and knowledge, then, are the two components of Christ's teaching. Again, I quote, "You urge nothing else than believing, you command nothing else but loving." Chapter 25, the same work, expresses this message in the context of the communal mystagogic exercise taught to the monks. Each spirit, says Cusa, will see something in God that it wishes to reveal to others. Here's the communal dimension again. He concludes, the spirits filled with love reveal their secrets to each other, and the knowledge of the beloved is increased, as well as desire, and the sweetness of joy blazes forth. Now, I think we can all forgive Don for the relatively minor peccadillos of his youthful article, Intellect and Mystical Theology in Nicholas of Cusa, because his document of repentance, his Retractatio, allows us the opportunity to enter into this rich and always fruitful area of Cusanus' teaching, the relation of affect and intellect, love and knowledge. We can also thank him for inviting Paula to be a part of this discussion, because her paper From Affectus to Caritas, which I had not read before, highlights an important and often overlooked aspect of Cusanus' teaching on love, that is, the way in which love of neighbor is integral to the ascent to God as Caritas. As I write over these materials, a number of things struck me, and I'll mention three of them. The first is that, as Don says, it is clear that Cusa's mind developed on this issue. This leads me to wonder how fruitful it would be to give a detailed account, kind of roadmap, of the stages of his development on the relation of intellect and will, studying the issue across his treatises, but especially in his sermons. Second thing that struck me was to muse on the issue of to what extent it might be legitimate to ascribe to Cusa's thought some of the famous slogans regarding love and knowledge found in Western thought. And here I'd particularly mention the 12th century originally Gregorian maxim, amor ipse intellectus est. Amor ipse intellectus, or intelligentsia est. Did Cusa ever cite this formula? I don't know. I asked those who've read more of Cusa, especially the sermons. He almost certainly would have run across it in his reading. The third thing I want to thank Don for is another opportunity that this discussion afforded me. It gave me a chance to read, for the first time, Cusa's Sermon 7. This is an amazing document and deserves to take a place among the major statements of the power of love in Christian mysticism, although a love that even at this early stage still coincides with knowledge. Although love is by far the dominant theme, the sermon incorporates both love and knowledge into all three stages that are outlined. The first stage, which is just plain amor, has Magdalene saying that her love of God is enhanced because she sees with the eye of the intellect, that all things are empty in themselves. That's number 26. Later, number 32, she says, when my intellect and affection lovingly reflected on these things and lovingly reposited them in my memory, so here we have intellect, affection, and memory, then I ascended to the first stage. With regard to the second stage of love, which he calls amor fervens, Magdalene speaks of recalling God's gifts and also says, and I quote, Caritas for God was strengthened in me when I passed over to a knowledge of his existence. And when in deepest humility, I despised my entire self. That's number 27. Finally, with regard to the third stage of love, the amor languens, she mentions the recollection of the beloved that touched the inner recesses of my mind. That's number 29. And in number 30, text that Don just referred to, she glosses the two wings given to the woman in heaven in Apocalypse 12, saying that the wings are affection and intellect, so that the woman, that is the Magdalene, can fly into the desert of contemplation and penitence. Regarding the same third stage, she says that she pondered and reflected on the beauty of my beloved. And later, love commands her, I quote, multiply your affection and your understanding regarding the demands of your beloved. So intellect is scarcely neglected in Sermon 7. It's interwoven with all three stages of the ascent of love. But let me say just a bit more about what struck me about this sermon, particularly about the background. The Hopkins translation, at least, I haven't had a chance to check all the footnotes in the critical edition yet, but the Hopkins translation makes some references to you of Balma and to text from the Song of Songs, but I must confess to finding these inadequate. There are far more references to the Song of Songs than Hopkins cites in his notes. And the structure of the sermon, albeit it might have been partly diffused through you of Balma, is really based on Bernard of Clairvaux. The three kisses of the first verse of the Song of Songs, ascoleto meoscolo oris sui, is a hallmark of Bernard's mysticism. See Sermon Super Cantica 3-8. The triple pattern of the kiss of the feet, the kiss of the hands, the kiss of the mouth was indeed used by many later mystics, but everybody knew it was originally from Bernard. Cusa's development of this theme is one of great richness, especially in the way in which he relates it to the life of Mary Magdalene. The Magdalene, of course, had been a popular theme for preaching since at least the time of Gregory the Great, whose gospel homilies 25 and 33 are devoted to her. But Cusanus seems to have been the first to link the three kisses of the song with the figure of the Magdalene, the great penitent, ecstatic lover, the holy contemplative in the wilderness. Another clear mark of Bernardine influence in Sermon 7 is the distinction between two kinds of ecstasy. Again, Don mentioned this. Number 29. The Magdalene says, Very frequently, I fell into states of ecstatic affection together with ecstasy of mind. Because of that very vehement love, I did not want to belong to myself, but was my beloved's. That's again, Song of Songs 2:16. I sent forth my spirit so fervently to my beloved that I was ecstatic in mind. In his sermons on the Song of Songs, 49:4, Bernard, for the first time that I know of in Christian mysticism, makes a clear distinction between ecstasis in mente and ecstasis in affectu. I quote, "For holy contemplation has two forms of ecstasy, one in intellect, the other in the will, one of enlightenment, the other of fervor, one of knowledge, the other of devotion." Furthermore, two of the central tropes of this sermon, the wound of love and languishing of love, are based on the Song of Songs. And these themes are also found in Bernard's sermons. Again, the notion of mystical death, mors mystica, very important in Cusa's Sermon 7, see numbers 29, 32, and 33, is also in Bernard, Supracantica 52. Another theme is the embrace of the bride by the left and right arms of the divine lover, based on Song 2:6. That's Sermon 7, number 31. You can find that discussed in detail in Bernard's Supracantica 51. The important theme of the Ordo Amoris, the order of love, which is founded on Song of Songs 2:4, discussed in number 24 of Cusa's sermon, was much developed by Bernard of Clairvaux, Supracantica 49-50, and De Diligendo Deo 14. Now, I conclude by saying failure to note these parallels occludes what Cusanus knew of the broader mystical tradition and how much he utilized its richness at this early stage of his career. I think a full analysis of this remarkable sermon, which I cannot give here, is enough at least to indicate that the early Cusanus was a master of the language of love, and this sermon should take an important part in the long tradition of discussions of love in Christian mysticism. So that's what I have to say today. Thank you.
There's a lot more in what you said than was in what you sent out, so I wouldn't mind seeing it, the slight revisions with extra sources in.
Yeah, I did do a revision, having a chance to reread the sermon several times. So my mind is evolving.
I think everybody's mind is evolving at a great rate this afternoon. So now it is time for the working session, which means it's you guys' turn. And all I can say is if you're on my screen, that is, if you're on the Zoom, you're in front of me on the screen. And if you raise your Zoom hand or you wave your regular hand a little bit to, if you leave the Zoom hand up, I'll see it even if I don't see the hand wave. So try to do both if you can. And mention, if you will, in your question, whom you'd like to see answer it first, if you want to. If you say, I want Don to talk about such and such, or I want Bernie, or I want Paula to say something. So let us know which person you would like to hear from first, if you will. And I see William Highland already has a hand up, so go for it, Bill.
Hi, thank you, everyone. I wanted to just address what Bernie was just saying about Sermon 7, because I just have an article that's going to be coming out that does deal with Sermon 7, but a little different aspect, how much he uses Bonaventure in his sermons, because you wouldn't know it from Hopkins' notes, but from the Latin, paragraph after paragraph in that dialogue is lifted verbatim from the Breviloquium as well, interspersed with Bernard quotation. So it's fascinating. And it's part of a little project I'm doing on his use of Bonaventure in the sermons in general. But again, that Sermon 7 is a mind-blowing sermon, I think. So I just wanted to thank.
I had a suspicion in reading it of Bonaventure, but as I said, I didn't have access yet to the critical edition. I would say one more thing. It might be very interesting to compare Sermon 7 with some of the other great treatments of Magdalene as the lover of Christ. I'm thinking 200 years minus a few years after Cusa's sermon, Pierre de Bérulle 1627, wrote his Elevation to the Magdalene, one of the central texts, and it would be a fascinating comparison to write an article comparing Cusa and Berulle on the Magdalene as the great lover.
Mm-hmm. I'd just like to come in very briefly. Bill's right. There are huge chunks that are straight out of the Breviloquium of Bonaventure. And there are other chunks, not as substantial, from Rudolph of Bieberbach. Yep. And if I understand right, Rudolph was published as circulated in Bonaventure manuscripts.
Yes.
So a lot of this is cribbed. And an interesting question would be to sort out, editing is really a creative process. Cusanus is very good at it. And then how much of it is kind of original in the way he frames it, and what bits and pieces he kind of emphasizes and develops on his own.
And
It's an astonishing sermon.
William of Laodicea as well, his Compendium of Theological Truth. It's clear that Cusanus had these, for want of a better word, theological textbooks at his disposal. But like you say, what he chooses to take from them is fascinating. To craft this dialogue where Magdalene is the dialogue partner, essentially with Bonaventure's Breviloquium and Bernard. And it's just amazing. Like you say, on the one hand, he's cribbing, but what a way to crib. I mean, it's a work of art, really, how he does it.
Sounds like many a modern sermon writer. And Paula has her hand up, and when she's done, you can put it down for her. But Paula has
I put it down. Yes, I wanted to add to the sources, or to the association about the sources, because I was strongly reminded of Augustine, actually. But Augustine is a common source for everybody. Bernie, you mentioned memory.
Yep.
And the three stages in Augustine, the soul, in order to find truth, I'm thinking of the Trinitate, but everywhere, has to return to itself, to its own interior. And in this intentio, it remembers itself. Memoria comes first. Then it knows itself and loves itself, right? And these three movements appear in Sermon 7, but the order is altered. First,
yeah.
Did you notice that? First, Mary Magdalene sees with the eye of the intellect or something like that, and then she remembers all that she has received from God, and then she empties her own will, and she finds that all that matters is God's law. So love goes directly to God. But I found it interesting. I found the fact that intellect comes first. It was interesting that one knows oneself before remembering oneself. For Agustin, you have to remember yourself first, and then you know yourself, right?
You know yourself in the present, and you remember yourself in the past, and that's important to St. Augustine's work on time in the Confessions.
Yeah. If I could just make one point on the whole notion of compilations, and there is a sense in which a lot of this sermon is, of course, a compilation, but when we say compilation, we tend to say, oh, that's not original then, so you kind of throw it out. But the point, and I'm just really underlining what was said before, it's how someone like Cusa compiles what he puts together from different pieces of the tradition, how he does that, what he adds when he feels something needs to be. That's what's interesting. Not just the fact that, this is found in this one and this is found in that one. But that there's something original gets produced out of the process of compilation, especially true in the late Middle Ages and the early modern period among the mystics.
Well, now, is there anyone in the room here? I don't see a hand yet here, but is there anyone in the room here who wants to put a hand up? Or are you all just blown away by the magnificence of all this? It's beautiful stuff coming out. Yes, Simon. Simon?
Thank you. Thank you very much. With the mention of Augustine and Bonaventure, I'm I'm wondering if part of the kind of the solution to what we've been discussing is Cusa as a Trinitarian mystic, because I recall looking in the later sermons, which also draw on Bonaventure, that this motif of coincidence of intellect and will is very strong, and is also linked to the kind of Trinitarian dynamic of the theological virtues. And I'm wondering how Cusa as a Trinitarian mystic compares to the other participants in the debate, and whether he's actually really bringing together the two strands in that kind of Trinitarian way. And actually, I'd appreciate comments from any of the speakers on that. It was a very enjoyable session.
Question is beyond me, Simon, so I'm going to defer to my colleagues.
Well, I would just say that the direction you're going in seems to me to be a very fruitful one, but that would be part of what I was talking about. We need a fully realized study across Cusa's writings of how he relates love and knowledge, and where that fits into other important dimensions of Cusa's thought, particularly his Trinitarian thought. We don't, as far as I know, we don't have that. We have bits and pieces, but it's never been isolated as a particular problem in Cusan's studies, and it's a problem that would need a monograph, I think, not just an article. But that's.
So Paula again has something to say.
Yeah, I don't know if I have something to say, but I want to say something about what Simon was saying. I think that in the debate, during the debate, the exchange of letters and the treaty, well, the Visione Dei is something else. He does not develop or make explicit his Trinitarian view of the human mind. I think that is best found in the Conjecturis. Not only because the whole book is Trinitarian, but the relation between knowledge or intellect, justice, and love is treated, I think, in paragraphs 177 and 183. That's where I found the most clear expression of the relation between these three aspects. I would say that when the mind knows itself, it knows in itself the reflection of equalitas, of the logos. And that reflection is the golden rule, which is our measure for justice, our inner measure for justice, which must be formed by love, right? But Bernard McGinn has an article on Cusanus triads, right?
Yes.
But so you must have more than me to answer on this subject.
No, I'm in full agreement with what you're saying.
Seems to me that in doing the readings,
I have a
everything I
question.
said was everything that was said by everybody had a Trinitarian aspect to it. That's all I wanted to say.
I have another point. One of the things that really strikes me in rereading De Visione Dei, and this goes back to, I was rereading Bernie's long, wonderful essay on Cusanus in the Harvest volume. Bernie, you make the point that Cusanus is one of the very few, perhaps the first, to really shift the focus in terms of not just between desire and intellect, but one of the very first to really focus on and try to work out what the Visione Dei, the vision of God, looks like in this life. And that in the section for today, you're talking about the intellect love debate, but then Nicholas sets that aside to turn to the really important question, the question of vision. And Larry Bond, of happy memory, many of us in this room, took the same kind of tack with it. and suggests that as he goes on to his last works, especially the De Appice Theoriae, that it's this positive vision that takes over. The apophatic kind of slips back, and there's this kind of light and vision that takes over at the end. And so I think in terms of the discussion we're having today, the really interesting and difficult question, the one I have no answer to, is how do love and intellect, desire, and all of those things, how do they fare and how do they kind of guide us? And is it the case that in vision and they all kind of find perfection, or do they all kind of disappear into something else? It seems that both love and intellect kind of pale or give way at that last moment of vision.
Isn't that vision above even intellect at some of the writings?
The question then, is it also above desire? Because Vincent of Augsbach and Hugh Obama say desire gets you there and gives it to you.
Ah, yes.
But it seems that it may also be beyond love and desire.
That's a good question. So
that would be very Dionysian.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, when we look particularly at the mystical theology in the 5th chapter, it's also in the 1st chapter, where you go beyond. I think intellect is the discussion that's going on, but I think what happens is you're going beyond any concept, any knowledge, any kind of operation of the intellect that we have, and also perhaps of our operations of our affectus and love.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why Cusa would disagree with what you can call the affective Dionysianism, which says, oh, the apex of affectus is the high point. Maybe it's not the high point. Maybe the high point is a visio that goes beyond apex affectus and even all forms of intellectus.
So Jason.
I was kind of torn between two different questions that I wanted to ask. I'm just going to ask both and let you all deal with that. The first is on the point that you just raised on and that Bernie's addressing, is to recall that Valerie also drew our attention to this kind of question of what's beyond the walls of paradise, or whether one can see God's face and live, right? We'll see the Porette tomorrow as another way of thinking about that sort of question. So I wanted to recall that we were discussing that already in earlier conversation. But I want to also come back to, and this is why I said there were two questions. I wanted to come back to something. I'm going to turn this off. Hold on. Okay. Divine wind was blowing.
Yes.
And I want to shut it down and ask about a much more worldly wind. I want to come back to what I thought Paula was hinting at about not just the movement of ascension, but also the importance of the world. And it talked about love being a part of the dimension in the self-knowledge. The self-knowledge is, when it's perfected, is also a knowledge of the golden rule of not only the love of God, but the love of others, right? Which requires a community and it requires a world. It requires seeing God manifested in the world, incarnated. That's our access to it. And so there's even if in this final moment, there's some kind of destruction of individuation or intellect, we only get there through this worldly access. And I wanted to encourage Paula to elaborate on that thought. I mean, I have my own suspicions, but I tend to be very much more secular than the rest of this group. So I wanted to encourage you to speak to that a little, Paula, if you'd like.
To speak about exactly what, sorry, Jason, about the fact that the community is needed.
The community and that the world are
Yes.
essential to this. I don't mean the word essential in a very technical sense.
I agree. There's no progress without the world for Nicholas. And sometimes when he speaks only of knowledge, like in the Mente, when he has when it's epistemological, it seems like a failure. We need the senses. But when he speaks of the soul's ascent through love and through justice, knowledge of I think that the thing is that the golden rule does not tell us what to do. That's the fascinating thing. It's in a way, it makes you go back to your interior and reflect on what do you think it would be best for you to be done. Well, you know how it goes. In order for the equality, or for the reflection of equality that we find inside us to become concrete, to become actual, it has to be challenged by the world, and then the world by the others, not the world by proximity, by our neighbors. And then we have to go back to our interior, reflect, and go again into the world to apply the result, right? So it's an ongoing exchange.
Right.
It's empty. It's an empty criterion without the world,
So
without the community.
you used that word practical earlier, and it's
Yeah.
I think it's only been used once or twice today. You used it a moment ago, right? Despite Bernie's caution against bending things, the other binary that we've forgotten maybe is the binary between the contemplative and the active, right? And it may be worth recalling that, not because I want to enforce it, but to not forget the active dimension, the practical dimension, the role of judgment. And in the particular situation, in the world, rather than the universalizing tendency that's usually associated with the contemplative
Exactly. There's no progress without exchange, or in exchange with the world. And I think Augustine presents sometimes the same problem, where the main thing seems to be the relation between the soul and God, and our neighbors seem to be only a means to, right? So it is true that it is not something that Nicholas emphasizes, but he devoted his whole life to practical issues. So I think that part of the answer is there, right? The coincidence between his theory and his practice.
Thank you. So they were both bishops. They both had to be dealing with the world when they weren't contemplating God, didn't they? So who else?
There's Sean Hannon there.
Sean.
Sean?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes, Sean. And then William.
Okay.
Go ahead. We can hear you.
Okay, great. Just building off of this exchange between Jason and Paula, I was thinking a little bit of Catherine of Siena here, because in the 14th century, she uses Caritas in a very explicit context of how Christian love is supposed to shape economic activity, which is, about as practical as it gets. And here I'm borrowing a bit from a great bit of work I've read by a scholar named Eloise Davies on Catherine of Siena as a political and economic theorist in the 14th century, where in some of these Italian cities, you have debates ongoing about the nature of private property and how Christians should react to these new ideas about private property. And so she brings in Caritas as love of neighbor to kind of weigh in on these debates about private property and sometimes push back against new ideas about how private property should be functioning in an urban setting, sometimes to say that it's okay to have these kind of new ideas of private property as well. So I guess what I'm wondering is, when you talk about Caritas and kind of this idea of, we're being forged by our relations with our neighbors, which hopefully embody Caritas, is there a room for economic practices in there? So I guess we can ask that question on two levels. Do you think we can kind of bring economics into this conversation in general? And then more specifically, is there anything you've seen in Cusanus where he brings in economic issues into this kind of conversation? Thank you.
Whom are you asking? Sorry.
Economics. Can we bring in economics to this idea of Caritas?
No, whom are you asking? Who was the question addressed to?
Oh, to you.
Okay, sorry. I don't know. The only Cusanus, when he describes society, at least in his philosophical works, as far as I know, he is very much the idealist in this sense. The theoretician or theoretical man, not the idealist. I'm thinking, for instance, in the Docta Ignorancia, book 3. There's a description. I can't remember now the place, but I can look it for you. There's a description where he says how society naturally organizes according to each person's gifts. For instance, I mean, he stresses diversity and the value of diversity, but he's not horizontal, as we all know. So between the various gifts that we received, I don't know, intellect is better than strength. I remember that he puts the example that Solomon should rule, not Samson. And then, as far as I remember, the Concordancia Católica, but I'm sure that here somebody can pitch in and say something better than I. Again, he always has this kind of naturalistic optimism, in which, for instance, those who are not so gifted, and for him to be gifted is to be gifted with intellect and reason, those who are not so gifted understand through reason the need to submit to those who know better. That's what I remember in the Concordancia Católica, but I can't recall anything specific on economics, Sean. Sorry.
I can. There's a sermon, it's in the 200s, it's a Brixton sermon about coins. It's show me the Pharisees and the Herodians come and they say, well, who should we pay taxes to? Do we have to pay taxes to Caesar? And he says, show me the coin. No, it's whose image is this? And he goes on at great length in that sermon. And then there's also the discussion of money and banking in De Ludo Globi. And human beings, we are God's coin because we are coined in God's image. And you got the bankers, the human intellect then has to sort out and do the kind of the currency exchanges, actually figure out the value so that we can actually prize what needs to be prized. And as Thomas Volke pointed out to me, that when he was writing, especially that sermon, he was all tangled up in the financial affairs of his diocese. And as a very practical matter, what Nicholas did, what really got him into big trouble, is when he got to Brixton, the diocese was broke and all the money was going to the Duke. And he managed to kind of recoup it so that by the end, the Duke was borrowing money from Cusa, from the Brixton diocese. And he didn't like that. And so there's the practical side of it. But in terms of the De Ludo Globi and that sermon, there isn't the question really of economic justice that's raised. It's kind of the symbolics of coin and image and likeness, and that we have to then kind of, we are gold, at least men are gold, women are silver. And he's got the gender thing going on there too. So it's a very complicated thing, but I don't think, Sean, that he really addresses your question of kind of life and community and whether money is a good thing and this is how it should be used. But he does discuss it at great length, and it's clear that Nicholas understood money. He
Thank
really
you.
understood money, gathering, benefices and stuff early on, all through his career.
Okay, thanks a lot, Don.
This is the Duke, you must have done something right.
Yeah.
So someone else in the room maybe, or wait a minute, I think William had your hand up, and Jason is telling everybody to buy the book, but.
No, I just was giving everyone a citation to Don's essay. which
Oh, well.
discusses that.
That's where the article is. It's in Jerry's Festschrift.
Okay, William, I think you had your hand up before.
Thank you. Yeah, this goes back to something Don was saying, and this is coming out of ignorance on my part, so anyone who wants to answer or help me answer. For someone like Bonaventure, the idea of sapientia, of wisdom, was a unifying concept that seemed to unify a lot of these things. Does Cusanus reflect on sapientia very much?
Oh, yes. There's the Idiota dialogue
And what concept?
of
So
Sapientia.
Is it a unifying concept for him?
Pardon?
Is it a unifying concept for him that unites faith, intellect, love, etc., as one, in a sense, as one thing?
To answer that, I'll leave some of my colleagues hit it. I think the short answer would be yes. And then there's the De Venatione Sapientiae, Hunt of Wit. And that's the framework for his overview of his entire career, of the different fields where the hunt has taken place, learned ignorance, possessed, and so on. And so in that sense, it clearly is an integrative concept.
Okay.
But maybe, Paula, Bernie, or anybody else would have another take on it.
Well, wisdom in the tradition is always an ordinatio. It's what relates different disciplines to each other. I mean, you can find that treated in Thomas Aquinas, for example, in great detail. So it's not anything new, but I think it certainly it speaks to the tradition, the Bonaventurian tradition, even the Thomistic tradition. And I think you're right, especially the De Venatione Sapientiae in the late Cusa, it's very central to him. Trying to putting things together.
Mm-hmm.
And in Idiota de Sapientia, which he has this tetralogy, the Mente books, the one that is devoted to Sapientia, he opposes it to the knowledge of the world, William, if that was your question. It is the wisdom that has a flavor, and it's in us. It is once again the image of the Logos.
So is that something that, for want of a better word, is that something that remains when we have the vision of God? Then is that wisdom go beyond any of the particulars of intellect or whatever, or faith, or whatever else we want to say? And is that what allows us, that image of the Logos, that sapientia, is that what allows us to interface, so to speak, with God? Is that what remains? I don't, for him.
It's what makes us, it puts at the beginning and at the end. Because it's I'm thinking now, it combines desire and knowledge, an incipient knowledge at beginning, and that then will perfect itself. But it's the pregustatio. It's something that you have this sort of previous feeling. He compares it with a perfume that is spread in the world and that awakens us and calls us. So it's a two-pole thing. It's something that's being born in us and something that calls us from the world in order to transcend it, right? So it's the beginning and it's the goal, I think. And it combines affection and intellect.
Right.
Simon's hand is up on the screen.
It was just a comment, really, that talking about Idiota de Sapientia reminded me of the scene in the Roman Forum with the people measuring and everything, and how those mathematical kind of economic relations could then be referred by Cusa up to the kind of the ascent to wisdom, and I think he quote wisdom as calling out in the streets. So it's again this theme of finding wisdom in the world and the mysticism in the world, even in the kind of
and the calculations in the marketplace. That's a good point, coming back to Sean's issue from before too.
And the camera probably didn't catch it, but Don was doing this behind the podium while he was. Someone in the room again, perhaps. We've got a lot of people on the screen. Yes, Jerry Hackett.
I'm very much a neophyte, so I'm going to ask a kind of an innocent question.
There's no such thing, Jerry.
We've spoken a lot about faith and about love, about vision. I didn't hear the word hope used at all, unless it's identified with desire.
You didn't hear the word
Hope.
hope used.
Out of the theological virtues.
Yeah.
I think you're right. We didn't mention it. I'm not sure how to get that back into the loop.
It's okay, we didn't mention faith either.
We did,
Yes, we did.
Oh, a
Yeah,
Thank you.
little bit.
Okay.
What do you want to say about hope, Jerry?
What I wanted to ask, it was obvious by its absence in the discussion.
Best of it. So Eric has your hand up.
I have a question relating to Cusanus's sermon, Hallelujah, Come Holy Spirit, where he introduces the language of spirit and how the language of spirit is related to his treatment of intellect and affect. Because it has the interesting line in there that, but the intellect does not yet come to perfection so that it is a spirit. And I was just curious in terms of Nicholas's pneumatology, and there are other changes over the course of his intellectual career, and where the language of spirit becomes placed in his treatment of intellect or mind and affect.
It's a very good question. I don't know the answer.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that there is one answer, but maybe some of the others have a clue on that. That sermon is one that we're supposed to talk about tomorrow, I think. So we're jumping the gun on it, but you're certainly entitled to bring it in. I just kind of skimmed through that sermon. I've got to look at it again before tomorrow morning. Anybody else, any other takes on the issue of how Cusanus pneumatology, his doctrine or his teaching on preaching on spirit, relates to these other factors we've been talking about: affect, soul, intellect, love?
I was reading Sermon 57, and I wrote down a couple of passages that interested me. In number 29 of that, he says, "Spiritus est amare ipsum." Spiritus est amare ipsum. The spirit is love itself.
Mm.
That's one answer, Eric.
Yes, in that sermon, spirit is love. It's the Holy Spirit that descends in Pentecostes. Pentecostes would be in Spanish. Yeah.
But is it because of the language in terms of the pneumatological tradition, in terms of the work of the Holy Spirit, and that it perfects? Or
Yes.
do in terms of language of regeneration, and through regeneration comes perfection, you could say, of the relationship between intellect and affect.
That would be very nice.
Mm.
I'd like to see it come out that way, but I'm not sure that it does.
I'm just curious.
That's a good question. It's a good way of putting it.
Well, we have like a day to think about that. Not quite a day.
Not quite a day, no.
We are not rushed for time. If anyone still has a question, there is still time to ask it and discuss it a little.
We'll go back to what Sean was asking and shift the term from economy to diversity, which I think is the tack that Paula was taking to a certain extent, the question of the diversity of community and how you build a kind of political unity while also acknowledging diversity. And so for that, you'd bring in speculative treatises, you bring in the Pace Fide, but I don't know the sermon tradition well enough. No.
Well, the speculative tradition would certainly be all right, and De Pace Fide would certainly be relevant, I think.
Well, in terms
Somebody has
of
something
the
to say.
nitty gritty, somebody before mentioned a text that a number of us in this room do know very well, the De Concordantia, where it works out the whole mechanics of representation and the one and the many in the very concrete political life of a church and a community and even the empire. And of course, one of his key concerns is the one of the many, the diversity question comes with that. And in the De Pace Fide, of course, there's this wide open kind of, at least on one level, wide open tolerance and respect, and saying we need these different traditions because no one of them can capture the whole package. No one of them gets us there. Although when you read the whole dialogue, it's clear that it's the Christian one that is the package for them.
Yes. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Paula.
You are a ring expert at the Concordantia.
I just was going to say that diversity is always organized in a hierarchical or order, right? In a hierarchy.
Yeah, he's not one of these lateral thinkers like Deleuze.
No, right. He's not horizontal.
No. It's not the way he takes the fold, as David reminded us last night.
You mean what, Marxist?
No, Cusa was not a Marxist. I think that's pretty clear.
David had me convinced. I'm sorry.
Sounds like I should have been there.